Our next guest speaker is Desmond Cole. He's a Canadian journalist, activist, author, and a broadcaster. He hosts a weekly radio program on News Talk 1010. It was previously a columnist for the Toronto Star and has written many publications. Desmond is also an author of the national best-selling book, The Skin We're In, the Year of the Black Resistance and Power. Desmond, could you please take the mic?
Again, so good evening, everybody. Good evening to local QP79. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Aveline. Thank you, everybody who's joined us. And it's such a pleasure to be on the same panel as Akila and as Louis, two people who, for as long as I've been doing what I've been doing, have been fighters for Black people's liberation and freedom and for a broader sense of social justice in this city and in this country. So good evening, everybody. I would like to begin by saying rest in peace. Rest in peace to Regis Korchinski-Paquette, to DeAndre Campbell, to Aisha Hudson, to Jason Collins, to Chantel Moore, and to Jamal Francique. All of the names that I have just read off are the names of Black and Indigenous people who have been killed by the police in Canada since the beginning of this year. And those are only the names that I personally know of. I'm sure that there are more. We're seeing an uprising in the United States of America like we haven't seen in a very long time. It's not the first time. And it's echoing around the world, not because we are envious of the United States, not because we think that we're the same as them. It's not about that. It's because Black people in this part of the world, in Canada, know that the ways in which they are demonstrating and fighting back reflect our own lives, our own experiences in this country, and our own challenges. I want to talk mainly about that uprising and what it can mean for us here in Toronto. And I also want to echo what Louis and Akila have said. They both talked about silent participation, silent consent. And, you know, Akila talked about white rage. I want to bring these things together to first give us a working definition of white supremacy. Why do people say white supremacy when they could just say racism? Or they could just say anti-Black racism or anti-Indigenous racism? Why do people talk about white supremacy in 2020? Well, it's because racism doesn't just come from the sky. White supremacy isn't just an ideology. White supremacy is a set of systems. And this is what I want us to focus on, is that it's systems that are created with the white supremacist ideology in mind, so that those systems will always privilege white people above other people. Why do we still have white supremacy and anti-Black racism in our midst today? It's because the systems that were created to privilege white people are still operating. We never got rid of them. So we want to pretend that white supremacy or racism is an individual thing. That if you just push racists to the side, then you get rid of racism. If you just tell racist people to be quiet or stop being racist, then you can get rid of racism. The problem is that the systems that are designed specifically, all of our government institutions, are corporate systems. These systems are also designed to privilege white people, and they're all still here. By the way, you cannot change these systems by having well-meaning people inside of the system. There is a reason why there are more Indigenous children in child welfare today than there were at the height of the residential school system. And that's because apprehending children in Canada is a system designed to target Indigenous people. And these days we see that in Toronto, 40% of the new cases of child apprehension are Black children. You don't change that by getting a new vice president or getting in some new personnel or doing some new training. The system that was designed to target these groups of people has to be dismantled. So I want to start there. which is about why we talk about white supremacy and not just say racism. This is the reason why. And people might say, well, Desmond, other people can be racist too. Yeah, they certainly can be, except that they haven't designed systems that operate in Canada to privilege their particular form of racism. That's what's critical. I want to talk about policing. People might wonder, why does Desmond always talk so much about policing? It's because the city of Toronto that we live in has decided that policing is the most important thing in the city that it can provide as a service, that policing is more important than childcare. The city of Toronto has decided that policing is more important than transit or food programs or artistic programs. And the reason that we know that is because fully 1/4 of the city of Toronto's budget goes towards policing. And I have to talk about policing in an era where Black people are burning down police stations because that is the only way that they can see to get the attention of the world that they won't be treated the way that George Floyd or others are treated. That radical and drastic action is the only thing that woke the American people out of their complacency. I hope we don't have to burn any buildings in this country for it to get to that. But I am not so sure when I look at the way that things are going in the city of Toronto. Louis is part of an organization called Zero Gun Violence. And the idea of having zero gun violence is actually an abolitionist philosophy. I can't speak for Louis, but I am sure that he would agree that the target is zero. It's not reducing, it's not having it happen half as much. It is abolishing the death of people in our community by guns. I'm an abolitionist as well. I'm an abolitionist of the police because some of the gun violence that happens in our city is perpetrated by the police. And they're not an outside entity when it comes to us talking about violence. They are a huge part of systemic and structural white supremacist violence. And they are a good example of how it doesn't matter if a Black person, namely Chief Mark Saunders, has been head of the police for the last 5 years. That doesn't change what the police were designed and paid to do and are still doing. So let's talk about the fact that while our police are getting 1/4 of all of our property taxes, they are doing things like increasing their surveillance in Black communities, increasing presence on Toronto community housing property. We have transit police now who will call the real police if they think that they need to do that, but who essentially engage in the same kind of behavior on the transit system, saying that the police budget doesn't get reduced when the city has to take a cut. Other services, like the ones that you folks may work with, are getting cut, but the police always have to have this increase and increase and increase because it is seen that they are more important than everybody else. And what are we getting for this focus on policing and all of these resources being spent on policing? We're getting a city where Black children are being criminalized before they're 10 years old. We're getting a city where the police follow our children home and ask them questions and try to turn them against their own friends. We have a city where most of the Black young men in this city are in a police database, not because they've committed a crime, but because the police have stopped and profiled them and continue to hold on to that information and to collect more and more and more of it. People are demonstrating against George Floyd's death in the United States, but that's not what brought them to burn down a police station. What brought them to burn down a police station is the combination of, yes, killing, but also profiling, surveillance, assaults, arrests, sentences that are harsher than white people do the exact same thing. It's the system that doesn't always kill you, and it's very sad that Black people have to be killed before some will even pay attention. But that is not the extent of what we are fighting for. So in my last minutes, I want to talk about abolishing the police. And I know that for many people who hear that, they say, well, it is impossible. I will tell you what is impossible. It is impossible for the police to stop killing us. That's what is impossible, because that has been their job on these territories for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it is only through the struggle of Black people who refuse when people tell them something is impossible, that all of us are even sitting here having this conversation and enjoying the rights that we do. Because if it wasn't for the Haitian Revolution and for Black people overthrowing slavery in the United States, none of us would be sitting here having this conversation. If it wasn't for the Civil Rights Revolution in Canada as well as in the United States, because people had to desegregate lunch counters in this country too. People had to fight to get into professional sports here too. Those are the rights that all of us enjoy. And there were times in those people's lives when people said it's impossible to change the system. Don't tell me as a Black person about what's impossible. What's impossible is that this colonial violence is going to stop on its own, or with a few well-meaning people who have nice words but who never take any action. Why do we need to abolish the police? I think it's very obvious. So how do we abolish the police? I want to go back to the death of Regis Korchinski-Paquette, and I want to make one important point. If you guys forget everything else that I say in this talk, I want you to hear what I say now, okay? Our society is designed so that when police are called to Regis Korchinski-Paquette's High Park apartment, and she ends up falling to her death after the police confront her, our society is designed to begin an argument over that person's body. An argument that argues about whether or not the police were right or wrong in the outcome, which was Regis's death. I can't do that because if I do that, I'm losing the plot. I'm losing my own humanity. This is not about an argument about whether or not the police are responsible. Of course the police are responsible. They were the ones who were called. You and I were not called to go to that apartment building that day and use our own training and skills to keep everyone safe. The police were called. So they failed. Whether they threw her off of that balcony or whether she was trying to get away from them and fell off of that balcony, they are responsible either way. And arguing over whether or not they are responsible, that is a white supremacist game because it keeps the structures that keep hurting us unquestioned while we fight over the details. Instead, what I would like us to do is to ask ourselves, if Regis was in some kind of crisis that day, was there someone else that we could have sent who didn't have a gun, who didn't have a taser, who didn't have a license to take Regis's life and then not be criminally charged for it? That is the question that we need to be asking ourselves, is why did that system fail this 29-year-old Black and Indigenous woman? Not whether or not the police should be held accountable, or not whether or not we need body cameras. Do you know what body cameras do, everyone? They help you watch Black people die. And in a system and in a society where we aren't decided yet whether or not Black lives are worth saving, that's what we do. We say, don't save the person's life. Let's have a video camera. And then we can watch the person die like George Floyd. And then we can argue over whether or not the police were at fault. Well, let me tell you something. That doesn't bring the person back to life. And it doesn't stop the next killing from happening. If any of you killed someone at work, the response would not be that all the rest of you were going to be watched on camera. The response would be immediate and swift criminal accountability for the person responsible. But that is not what happens to the police, and it never will, because the system is designed to protect them at our expense. We could send somebody else to Regis Korchinski-Paquette if we wanted to. We could send somebody else to go and make contact with DeAndre Campbell when he called the police himself, and when the police had been to his house many times before, knowing that this young man had mental health issues. We could send somebody without a gun, without a taser. We could send somebody without a license to kill, and it is our society that is choosing not to do that. So when we talk about defunding and dismantling the police, we're saying next time, when there's a noise complaint in your community, you don't send somebody with a gun. When there is a mental health crisis in your community, you don't send somebody with a gun. When there are people in your community who are having an argument with one another, you don't send somebody with a gun. But you also don't send somebody with a gun to administer a traffic ticket. Like, this is how far we have lost the thread, is that we think it's normal for somebody with a gun to come hand you a traffic ticket because you were going too fast. This is what Bell Hooks, the feminist scholar in the United States, calls dominator culture. This idea that you can only make people do the right thing if you threaten them with violence or death. That's what's leading to all of this carnage in our society. And it is also the reason why there are no resources available for other services, for mental health services, for housing, for childcare, for transit. The reason that there is no resources for these other services, y'all, is because the police budget is $1 billion and you have to add up several other services behind policing just to get what they have. So I see some of you talking in the chat about unemployment and jobs and job opportunities. The police have the best job security in this country. And that's not because they're better than anybody else. It's because of their union, so-called union. Because I'm going to stop in a minute, but I see a lot of people in the chat talking about whether or not the police are a union, and I want to actually address that in conversation. The police are not a union because unions don't get to carry guns around with them and use their force to intimidate other people into getting what they want. The police are a gang. And yeah, I'm going to take responsibility for my own words of saying that. The police are the most well-funded gang in the history of this country. And you know why? There was a demonstration for labor negotiating by the police about 10 years ago at Nathan Phillips Square. These were negotiations. So they wanted to do a demonstration. When the police did their demonstration at Nathan Phillips Square, a couple hundred of them, they all brought their guns and they weren't on duty. Those guns aren't supposed to belong to the police. They're supposed to belong to the public. But the police brought their guns to show that if you don't listen to what we say as the police, we are the enforcers and we will choose what to do with these weapons. Police in the past, when they've killed Black people and we have demonstrated against them, they have refused to answer calls for 911 because they were angry at being held accountable for hurting people. That's not a union. A union can't do something like that. The police are different. If we want to have mental health supports and services, if we want to have housing, if we want to have food programs, we can choose to take those things out of a budget of a force that comes after the fact. Police are not the sheriffs in the movies. They don't prevent crime. They're not running into the building to shoot the guy before he hurts somebody. That's the movies. In real life, the police come 99.8% of the time after the issue is over. And for more serious crimes, for those of you who are like, well, who will investigate sexual assault? Who will investigate murders? You don't need a gun to investigate something. That's what their prime job is, to investigate things and to lay charges. You don't need a gun to do that. We need forces for response and for investigation that don't have a license to kill. And then we need to redistribute the excess money to services that actually matter. So I'll end here. Josh Matlow and Kristen Wong Tam, two counselors in our city, are proposing to bring a 10% cut of the police to Toronto City Council. Now, Mayor Tory, who controls council, has already said he's not interested in that. But I want to criticize the two councillors who even brought this dumb idea forward in the first place. Their cut, their proposed cut to the Toronto Police Service is for 1 year. What kind of people would see Black people putting our lives on the line during a pandemic to go out into the street and demonstrate and say, you know what, we hear you. We're going to give you 1 year of a 10% cut of the police. Not even a permanent 10% cut, but 1 year. You know why they're doing that? Because they know that in this white supremacist reality that we're living in, Black lives don't matter enough for an 80 or 90% cut of the police. Black lives don't matter enough to stop the violence before it starts. Just throw them a cookie and hope that they stop yelling and stop demonstrating and stop fighting for their lives. We're not going to do that. I don't accept a 10% cut for 1 year as a response to people putting their lives at risk for our freedom. So defunding, disarming, and abolishing is the only way for us to truly have safety in our communities and to shift resources from policing to actual people. I will leave it there. I will say thank you to everybody once again. Thank you to the organizers. And I look forward to what discussion is left. And sorry for all the cutting out.